This video is sponsored by Squarespace. With the rumour mill full of Nico Hulkenberg to hash chat at the moment, I thought it would be fun to go back through the archives and find out just how close he got to scoring a podium. In case you didn't know, Nico holds the record for the most number of races in F1 history without ever standing on the podium. 184 races and counting. This is a stat a lot of people like to flog him with, and since the rumours of his return have gotten louder, so has the flogging. Is it a harsh criticism to be levelled at him, or is he a serial bottle job? Let's talk about it. 2010 in the Williams. Nico was the rookie, he was GP2 champion in 2009, came into the fold at Williams with big expectations, and all things considered, alongside Rubens Barrichello, a man with that much experience, I think he did a pretty good job. Brazil, P8. Now this was one to remember, and for good reasons. In his first ever season in Formula 1, round 18 of 19 at Interlagos, Nico Hulkenberg in the wet put it P1 in qualifying. P1! He was over a second clear of Sebastian Vettel in a Red Bull in P2. Insane. Unfortunately for Nico, the extra downforce Williams seemingly put on that car to optimise for the wet conditions on Saturday hindered him on a Sunday, had a poor start, got jumped by Vettel straight away, gradually fell down the order to a P8 finish, which afterwards he was happy. Obviously P1 was a bit of a red herring, kind of like Stroll Turkey in 2020. It was always going to be very difficult to hold on to that position. When it's wet qualifying, you get it mixed up sometimes. But no doubt, an incredible effort, and this is what put Hulkenberg on the map for sure. Yet, in a cruel twist of fate, for 2011, Nico would lose his Williams seat to Pastor Maldonado, the Venezuelan, bringing huge financial backing with him, backing that Hulk couldn't match. Very, very harsh on the German. He'd have to settle for a Force India reserve test driver role for 2011. Fortunately for 2012, Adrian Sutil would elect to leave Force India to chase a move to Williams, which actually ended up not going through, which left a vacant seat that Nico Hulkenberg would swoop up, so he was back full-time for 2012. Partnering everyone's favourite F1 pundit, Paul di Resta. You know what everyone's favourite website building platform is? Not Paul di Resta, Squarespace. Today's video sponsor. Now, if you didn't know, when Fernando Alonso classically said all the time you have to leave a place, he was actually referring to Squarespace. I promise. With thousands of beautiful drag and drop website template designs at your fingertips, it could not be easier to put together a gorgeous website. It's even easier than it is for George Russell to wind up F1 Twitter at the moment, because they're not happy with him. And unlike any seat in Formula 1, Squarespace is free to try out. You only need to pay anything when you want to put your finished lovely website live to the rest of the world. So when that time comes around, which is as inevitable as a self-deprecating Charles Leclerc radio message, head to squarespace.com/TommoF1 for 10% off your first website or domain. 2012, Force India. So back in the swing of things for 2012, he did outperform PDR, which especially in your first season at the team is always a very important thing to do. Valencia, P5. A race of many famous moments. Vettel breaking down and throwing his glove at the camera, Maldonado sending Hamilton into the wall, and Michael Schumacher achieving the final podium ever of his career. It wasn't a particularly special qualifying for Nico, P8, so a good job. And to be honest, the fact that Vettel, Hamilton and Grosjean all DNF'd from ahead of him in the race did make his final finishing position look better than it probably was. But a race of attrition on another day, maybe more people break down, maybe he does inherit a podium position, but P5 is what it was. Belgium, P4. Again, qualifying was nothing special. P12 in a Force India, with teammate Paul di Resta making it into Q3 and put it at P10, so PDR did a better job in quality. It was going to take something mad to give Nico any chance of doing anything in this race. And fortunately, Romain Grosjean came forth. After squeezing Lewis Hamilton into the entrance of turn 1, the chain reaction was one of the sketchiest pre-Halo crashes in modern F1 history. Romain, Lewis, Fernando, Sergio Perez and Pastor Maldonado, who jump-started, by the way, so that was karma, all fell victim, and all these 5 drivers started ahead of him. So this meant the subsequent safety car period ended with him in P3. Unfortunately, the race pace of his Force India couldn't keep up with eventual race winner Jenson Button's McLaren, Seb's Red Bull in P2, or Kimi Raikkonen's very underrated 2012 Lotus. Nico was only 2.5 seconds off of Kimi at the end, but he would finish P4. A great drive, and all things considered, I don't think you could have expected him to do much more, given the circumstances. Brazil, P5. Qualifying was great this time, a P7 starting position grid slot in a Force India, best of the rest, fantastic. And this was, of course, the final race of the season. This was back before in the pre-Abu Dhabi days. So there was also a title championship decider for Alonso and Vettel. We all know how that turned out. Vettel spun, came from the back, still managed to get enough points to win the championship. But a side story to this is this was Nico Hulkenberg's not just best chance to score a podium, but his best chance to win a race. Because in a race of continuously damp conditions, he kept it clean at the start, benefited from an Alonso lock-up into turn 1 and overtook Jenson Button in his McLaren to take the lead of the race going into lap 18, a lead he'd hold on to for 30 laps until lap 48. But inevitably, things started to go wrong. Firstly, a really slow, lazy spin going through turn 8, all on his own as well, saw Lewis take the lead. But it wasn't the end of the world. Lap 54, Nico went for the move into turn 1 at Interlagos. A few back markers about as well, which didn't help. Got on the slippery stuff, lost the rear end, clattered into Lewis. Ended Hamilton's race. He carried on. Nico was okay, but by the time he got it turned around, he'd fallen down to P5. And that's where he'd finish after his teammate Paul di Resta crashed, finished the race under safety car. I think everyone made mistakes that race. It was such tricky conditions. And look, Nico could have played it conservative. When he lost that position to Lewis, he could have just stayed in P2, and I'm sure he would have converted that podium. But instead, he had been leading the race. He knew he'd kind of thrown it away. He knew he had the pace, caught up to Lewis. Of course, you can't begrudge him for going for the win. And yes, he went for the move. Yes, it didn't come off. Yes, he ended up falling down to P5. But in that opportunity, in the 7th best car on the grid according to the Constructors' Championship finishes anyway, you've got to do it. You can't begrudge him. He would have regretted that for the rest of his career if he hadn't have gone for that win move and just consolidated P2. And talking of regrets, you'll regret it if you don't like this video and subscribe, right? Otherwise, I'm going to do absolutely nothing. 2013, Sauber. Undoubtedly one of his best seasons in Formula 1, Nico would join the Himmel-based team in Switzerland for the 2013 season alongside Esteban Gutierrez, who he would do an absolute demolition job on, to be honest. 51-6 in points. Mad. Monza, P5. Now, Hulk qualified P3. Very good. Behind both Red Bulls of Webber and Vettel, ahead of both Ferraris of Massa and Alonso. Gutierrez was down in P17, got knocked out in Q1. But it was always going to be an uphill battle to keep the Ferraris behind. And unfortunately, it wasn't to be. He was actually jumped off the line. That's kind of where it all unravelled. They got him, both Massa and Alonso got him off of the start. Falling down to P5, that's where he'd finished. By the end of the race, he was only 1 second short of Massa and 4 seconds behind Webber, who'd fallen down to P3. If he doesn't bottle it off the start, and unfortunately that is a bit of a trend in this video, then who knows, maybe he would have been able to hold onto that P3 because that Sauber clearly had pace. We know from Williams this season, you can have a rubbish car, but if it's optimised for Monza, optimised for straight lines, you can pull out a good result. Korea, P4. Again, the Sauber appeared to have good pace at the Korea International Circuit, with both Nico and Gutierrez making it to Q3 in P8 and 9 respectively. As for the race, well, Felipe Massa caused a bit of shenanigans, having a spin on the first lap, but Nico managed to avoid it all, stay out of trouble, and after the first round of pit stops, he was sitting P6. Perez, Hamilton, Rosberg and Webber all encountered various degrees of technical gremlins throughout the race, and Nico would end with a great little multi-lap scrap, mainly with Lewis. Fernando was kind of sticking his nose in towards the end as well. Nico was also worried a bit about the tyres falling off. He said he was pushing at 110% and thought the tyres would fall off like bananas towards the end. Whatever that means. Nico loves a weird analogy, like the hanging here like the cow. I mean, to be fair, he was upside down in a Formula 1 car when he said that. So, you know, fair enough, I guess. But for real though, this was a super impressive drive to hold off Hamilton and Alonso, two of the greatest F1 drivers of all time, in a Sauber to hold on to P4. Great job. But he did finish almost 20 seconds shy of Romain Grosjean's Lotus in P3. So the chance of a podium probably wasn't there. USA. P6. Now, Nico put an absolute stonking lap time in qualifying, lining up P4 in that Sauber in Austin. He was over 7/10 ahead of his teammate Esteban Gutierrez in P10. However, Lewis had a great start, jumped Nico early doors, and Fernando Alonso was able to use his race pace advantage to overtake Nico, pushing him down to P6. Not much more to say on this one. Expectation was high from qualifying, but P6 was still an incredible drive given the machinery he had. 2014, Force India. All changed for Nico in 2014. Back to Force India, a new teammate in Sergio Perez and a brand new set of car regulations to get on top of, and he'd do a pretty good job of it as well. Bahrain, P5. Now, Nico Hulkenberg did manage a P5 in the race prior to this at Malaysia, but for me, the Bahrain P5 was a better opportunity at getting on the podium because that is exactly what his teammate did. This was Sergio Perez's first podium in a Force India. Force India would get a few podiums, but unfortunately for Nico, it was always the other side of the garage doing the podiuming. Podiuming? That's not a word, is it? The big issue at Bahrain was qualifying, so Nico would go out in Q2, missing the cut-off by a couple of tenths, 4 tenths behind Checo, and Checo would line up P5, so it was looking much better for Sergio. Nico was on the back foot. Now, 2014 Bahrain Grand Prix is remembered for one thing: Lewis, Nico, Rosberg battling at the front. Great scrap between teammates. Lewis ended up coming out on top. That's what gets all the kind of plaudits. Perez's P3 kind of gets a little bit forgotten. And this was the race where Maldonado came out the pits and flipped Gutierrez because he wasn't looking where he was going. But further back, Nico was able to make incredible progress through the course of the race. By lap 26, he was both ahead of Sergio and hunting down Felipe Massa's Williams for P3. Unfortunately for Nico, in unsuccessfully trying to make a move on Massa, Checo, who was right behind him, saw an opportunistic move and got past Nico. Now, he did both eventually pass Felipe Massa, but Perez was ahead now. He was P3 on track, Nico P4, and both Red Bulls of Daniel Ricciardo and Sebastian Vettel were breathing down their necks. Ricciardo ended up passing Hulk but couldn't catch Sergio before the line, so Sergio finished P3, but Nico did hold off Sebastian Vettel for P5. So it was a fantastic Force India team result, and it's one of them that if Nico doesn't bottle that move or doesn't even go for that move on Massa, just takes a little bit more time, if he stays ahead of Perez, then their pace was pretty much the same before and after the swap of positions. I think he could have held on for P3 there. Canada, P5. And again, the race before this one, Nico managed another P5. So there was 2 pairs of P5s in a row. It was Monaco before Canada, but he was an entire lap down. So did he have a real shot at the podium? Not so much. At Canada, there was a bit more of an opportunity. In fact, it was a race where only half the grid, only 10 cars of 20 finished the race. And Daniel Ricciardo took his first ever win in Formula 1 as well. Quali was nothing special for either Force India, so Nico started P11, Checo was actually behind him. But the race was full of DNFs. Checo ended up getting taken out by Massa. Bianchi crashed on lap 1. Hamilton's brakes failed as well. Now, Nico brought it back P5. He was about 7 seconds off of Seb, who was in P3, so not a million miles off, but Seb did have brake issues himself. Look, on another day, it was a high attrition day at Montreal. Maybe in an alternative universe, he might have got it done, but it wasn't in this universe, I'm afraid, Nico. 2015 Force India, good competitive car this year, but he didn't finish any higher than P6, which he did on 3 occasions. 5 times he finished P7. Almost said P9. Checo, on the other hand, managed another podium, P3 at Russia, and he managed 3 P5s. So Checo definitely had a better season this year. There wasn't a standout drive that I had enough time to put into this video because this is already going to be a long one. So let's move on to the next year. 2016 Force India. Now, this car was an absolute weapon. They ended up finishing P4 in the Constructors. This was the best car that Nico had had up to this stage of his career, I think. But Checo did once again outperform Nico. He got 2 P3 finishes, 2 podiums this season. Nico, still nada. Monaco, P6. Now, this is an interesting one, right? Nico did a fantastic job in qualifying, putting his Force India P5. Checo was starting P8, and it was a wet race. So wet races at Monaco always give you more opportunities to pass, right? Because you're probably going to be using multiple tyre compounds, and that's exactly what happened. Yet by the end of the race, Nico just about pipped his namesake, Rosberg, to P6, whereas Checo finished on the podium. How did that happen? Well, at the end of the day, Force India gambled more on Perez's strategy because he was further back, and they were like, well, if we're going to gamble on one driver, we're not going to gamble on the driver who's higher up the field. And it ended up working out really, really well for Sergio and not so well for Nico. Force India decided to keep Checo on the wet tyre at the start for 6 laps more than Hulk before bringing him in for inters and then bringing them both in for slicks. These extra laps on the wet tyre over the intermediate, especially combined with, Checo's incredible ability to manage and conserve tyres, meant that he was able to make the most of it and get on the podium. So fair play Checo. If roles had been reversed, maybe they would have given Nico that strategy and maybe Nico would have delivered the podium. There was certainly an opportunity that day. Austria, P19. Now, this was a tough one to watch, right? Because Nico put it P3 in qualifying. Unreal job again in quali. Quali pace, you can't doubt Nico Hulkenberg's ability. You really can't. Behind both Mercedes, and even better for him, Nico Rosberg had a 5-place grid drop. So Hulkenberg would start on the front row. fantastic. Unfortunately though, as much as his qualifying pace is great, off the line, not so great. Once again, bottles it. He was down to P5 out of the first corner from P2. Nico, how? And then he'd continually just gradually fall through the field before a lap 64 brake issue forced him to retire. So technically he finished P19, but essentially it was a DNF. If he hadn't bottled the start so badly, maybe he could have held on to a P3. Who knows? Belgium, P4. Qualifying was great for both drivers. Perez just edged out Nico. They started P6 and 7 with about a tenth and a half between them. But the first lap, wow. Nico finally decided to turn up and sort out his clutch control, had an absolute worldie off the line, was already up alongside Checo into turn 1, and basically both Red Bulls and both Ferraris kind of all tripped up over each other. So Nico Rosberg was checking out at the front. Kimi Raikkonen had damage, Verstappen had damage. Hulk was just able to kind of pick his way through. And by the end of lap 1, he was P2. And by lap 6, Nico Hulkenberg's pace was good. He had a 6-second gap to Daniel Ricciardo in P3. However, Spa did what it does best, and it bit. Because Kevin Magnussen in his Renault dropped it at Eau Rouge, had a huge accident, which brought out the safety car. Now, Force India made a bit of a mistake here. These are back in the days where they'd put a safety car out for 5, 6, 7 laps sometimes, and then drop a red flag if they still can't fix the tyre barrier. The crash was so big nowadays that it get red flagged immediately. But because of the rule that you're allowed to change your tyre when there is a red flag, so basically get a free pit stop, Daniel Ricciardo and Nico Rosberg, who were leading, decided not to, but Hulkenberg and Force India decided to pit, hoping that the race wouldn't be red flagged and it would just have a safety car period, and then Nico would have fresh rubber to then attack Ricciardo and Rosberg. But of course the red flag did drop. Rosberg and Ricciardo had fresh tyres. Hulk was on older tyres, and then eventually he got swallowed up. Because Lewis Hamilton behind in the Mercedes was obviously, this is 2014, of course Lewis had the pace. It was inevitable, and he snatched P3 from Nico on lap 18 of 44. So there was nothing Nico was going to be able to do. All things considered, another unreal drive from Hulkenberg. He just didn't quite have the package to be able to fight for a podium. 2017, Renault. All changed again for Hulk and moved to Renault for 2017. His best result was a P6, which he achieved 4 times. Although this Renault was definitely a weaker car than the Force India team that he'd just left. His teammates were Jolyon Palmer at the start, and then last few races Carlos Sainz deputised because Hulkenberg was absolutely wiping the floor with Palmer. Let's not get it twisted. Singapore, DNF. Qualified P7, which is about as good a start as you could reasonably hope for in that car, best of the rest. And Jolyon Palmer was starting in P11, so clearly that Renault had some decent pace around Singapore. And again, this was Jolyon's best finish. He finished P6. Now, do you remember what made this race iconic? Vettel, Raikkonen bread, Verstappen ham in the middle. That famous crash going into turn 1 at Singapore, which also took out Fernando Alonso, meant that Hulkenberg on the safety car restart was sitting P3. And as the race played out, his pace was good. He was looking like he could certainly challenge for the podium sitting P4. However, a late hydraulic issue snatched any chance of that happening. He had to retire the car. Now, obviously, the podium was Hamilton, Ricciardo, Bottas, so it would have taken a huge amount. It probably would have been a P4, but that Renault was quick in those conditions on that track. Maybe it would have been a podium. I think that was a really good opportunity if the car hadn't broken down, which is a very Renault way for it to go wrong, isn't it? 2018, Renault. We're going to gloss over this season. It was 1 P5 at Hockenheim. That was his best result. Qualified 7th, finished 5th, was helped by his compatriot Sebastian Vettel famously crashing from the lead. But Nico was like 17 seconds off of P4 by the end, so there wasn't real podium opportunity there as far as I'm concerned. 2019, Renault. New teammate time with Carlos Sainz's departure to McLaren. Renault would break the bank to bring in Daniel Ricciardo, the disgruntled honey badger from Red Bull. Germany, DNF. For the second year in a row, Hulkenberg had an opportunity for a podium at his home race in Hockenheim, and once again, it didn't come to be. But this opportunity was huge because this race was mad. Like, it was such a exciting, interesting, long race, right? Qualifying wasn't anything special. Nico started P9, Daniel Ricciardo started P13, so Nico did a better job in qualifying. And then the race unfolded. If you haven't seen it, right, 2019 German Grand Prix, F1 YouTube channel, extended highlights is over 20 minutes long. Please watch that after this. It's so good. It was always damp on track, but it was more of a wet to dry race. And somehow Nico made his way from P9 to P5 by lap 2. Once he got to that place, kept it pretty clean and clear until Charles Leclerc crashed on the penultimate corner. beached it in the gravel. Lewis did the same thing, carbon copy almost. Max did a random spin as well, but Lewis managed to keep his car going and get it into the pits with a famous in. No, that wasn't that, was it? Now that's when Mercedes had the 1950s livery and ended up doing a pit stop like it was from the 1950s because it took so bloody long. This then delayed Bottas coming into pit, and basically Nico was sitting P2 after all of this madness. Bottas did manage to get Hulk back, so that put him back to P3, but again, it was looking good. And then lap 41 came along, and just as Charles had done, just as Lewis had done, Nico went wide at the penultimate corner and beached it. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to keep it going like Lewis was, and he was out of the race. When you consider Bottas would go on to crash, Daniel Kvyat in the Toro Rosso and Lance Stroll in Force India would go on to sit P3 and P4, I think that would have been it. I think he would have done it. And look, I can't be too critical of him because a lot of people had accidents on that race because it was a madness, but he squandered it. And just like that, at the end of 2019, for the 2020 season, it was announced that Esteban Ocon would be alongside Daniel Ricciardo and Nico Hulkenberg would be out of that Renault. However, because of the pandemic, there were a few opportunities for Nico to show what he could do in Formula One without having a full race seat. And there's one particular instance I think we need to talk about. 70th anniversary Grand Prix P7. Deputising for his old teammate Checo Perez at his old team Force India, Nico stepped into the now named Racing Point alongside Lance Stroll for the Silverstone doubleheader. The first two races, not much to write home about. P12 in qualifying, couldn't even start the race because the car broke down on the grid. I remember that specific moment and feeling a deep sense of sadness for him because that was so peak. However, because of 2020's weird pandemic calendar, we went back to Silverstone a week later and Nico Hulkenberg was right up for it. Nico got out of Q1 in P8. Good, solid, well done. Then he got out of Q2 in P2. That's a bit mad, but surely he won't be able to do that in Q3. Well, no, he couldn't. He fell down, but only one place to P3. He qualified P3 in a Force India he'd just jumped into and hadn't even had a race the weekend prior. He outqualified Max Verstappen in a Red Bull. That 2020 Racing Point, obviously being the Mercedes clone, was without a doubt the most competitive car Nico ever got to drive in Formula One as far as I'm concerned. It's just a shame he wasn't actually able to properly run a season in it. And sadly in the race he wasn't able to hold on to anything better than a P7 finish. Shenanigans with the tyres blowing up the weekend before. Teams had learnt from that. And that was his last chance, seemingly. Gone. So there we have it. Every occasion I've found, anyway, that Nico's got close to getting a podium. Maybe I did miss some. Let me know in the comments below if I did, if there's any Nico Hulkenberg bangers that I've missed. And also, now you've watched this, how do you reflect on this whole record and how it's kind of used against him? Because, look, I've gone through it. There's so many instances where on a different day, with circumstances out of his control, he would have got a podium. Did he bottle it on a few occasions? Yes, but not on every single occasion. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. My name's Tommo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.